Up, up, up. Hello and welcome to Vintage Garage. Several weeks ago we painted the chassis of the Titan Mk9 Formula Ford that we're restoring this season. The paint is now hardened to the point where we can begin assembly of the car. We'll begin the show working on the front of the car, installing the belly pan, front suspension, and steering rack. After that, we'll take a field trip to Reston, Virginia to look over a Titan Mk6 that's for sale. That should be a lot of fun. Lastly, when we get back to the shop, we'll assemble a rear suspension of the Mk9, completing the car to the rolling chassis stage. So stay tuned, we have a full show today. Glad you're here. Today's the day we've been waiting for a number of months. We're going to begin reassembly of the Titan Mk9 Formula Ford. We got through nickel plating all the suspension parts, all the pedals and all the various links and steering column and things that need to be nickel plated. So we have them on this bench all ready to put on. We also want to put on the original aluminum belly pan. After that we can put the chassis right side up and begin assembly of the suspension. As we go, the car will get pretty heavy. We don't want to turn it over to put the belly pan on at the very end. So let's do that now. The chassis is pretty light. You just have to be careful not to drop it. The first step is to wash the belly pan with lacquer thinner. Much of the crud on the pan is old paint and dirt, and the thinner removes most of it. The small piece of angle aluminum on the pan is a heel stop for the driver's feet. The stop is a little bent, so this is a good time to straighten it. We then polish the pan with steel wool using a circular motion. Then we apply some aluminum and mag wheel cleaner, again with a circular motion. When we finish, we do the same thing on the other side of the pan. We set the pan on the chassis. We're going to use aluminum pop rivets. They're not as strong as steel, but we're also interested in corrosion protection. The car will be driven in the rain, and we don't want the rivets rusting. We put a starter rivet in the middle of one side, and then in the middle of the other. We want to use the existing holes, and are careful to make sure we have the pan lined up. We use a 5/32 drill bit to clean the paint out of the holes, and it doesn't take much pressure. Then we install the rivets. There are several dozen to install. This is the last rivet. That came out nice. We're real pleased with the job. Again, as we turn the chassis back upright, we're careful not to drop it. This is one of the front camber links. Along with its matching leading link, it forms one of the front upper wishbones. Since we nickel plated this part, we run a tap through the threaded hole at one end to clean the threads, and then install a rod end into the threads. We lubricate and install a spherical bearing into the other end of the link, lightly tapping it in place with a punch, carefully positioned on the outer race. We install a small circlip to hold the bearing in place. Next, we clean the threads in the front right leading link and install a rod end in those threads. The other end of the leading link mates to the front camber link and doesn't use a rod end. We use an aligning punch to line up the holes and then install a grade 8 bolt through the parts to create the front right upper wishbone. We can now install it on the car. We test fit one of the lower wishbones to make sure we have the correct one, left or right. Then we repeat the steps on this wishbone. We install a spherical rod end in the cup at the end of the wishbone and then clean the threads in the part where we'll install the rod ends. We install a rod end in each leg of the wishbone and then install it on the car. Again, we use an aligning punch to line up the holes. We use the butterfly ratchet with a 9/16 socket mounted to tighten the bolts holding the wishbones to the car. We check the movement of both wishbones to make sure there's no binding. Both look great. We repeat the process on the left front of the car. We lubricate and install the spherical bearings in each wishbone, clean the threads in the legs, install the rod ends, and mount them on the car. Again, we check the movement to make sure there's no binding. We start the assembly of the coilovers by moving the spring pad out to its stop. We've painted the springs with black lacquer for a nice contrast with the silver dampers. Assembly is simple. We don't even need a spring compressor. We slip the spring over the end of the damper and then install a spring keeper. We then turn the spring pad up until we just start to compress the spring. The assembly is ready to be mounted on the car. The damper unit and the upper wishbone share the same bolt at the top. We also install a lower bolt and then tighten both with the butterfly wrench. We check the result for any looseness or play and repeat the steps on the other side of the car. We removed the steering rack and front uprights as a unit, and so we can replace them in like fashion. The rack is mounted on the chassis with 4 long bolts. The front anti-roll bar is next, and it's mounted with a pair of pillow blocks at each side. The blocks mount on the same 4 bolts as the rack. We slide the bar in place and position the blocks on the bolts. We then tighten the whole works with the butterfly wrench. We alternate between the bolts to apply even torque to the pillow blocks. We can then install the bolts that hold the front uprights to the wishbones. There's one at the top and another at the bottom. We slip the steering column into the rack and install a steering wheel. A single bolt passes through the wheel hub to hold it to the column. Lastly, we test the rack installation for any binding or looseness. We finished the assembly of the front suspension of the Titan Mk9. We've got all of the parts for the rear suspension. This is the rear lower A-arm. We nickel plated all the suspension links and all the other parts we need. But before we start into that, we're going to take a short field trip. People ask us how we find these cars. They're all British race cars from the 60s and 70s, and you'd think they'd be pretty scarce. Actually, sometimes the cars find us. Owners will call us up and say, hey, we've got a car you might be interested in. But sometimes we find them ourselves. In this case, the latest issue of the Straight Pipe magazine, the local publication for the Washington, D.C. region SCCA, arrived yesterday, and there was an ad in it for a Titan Mk6. It's one of those rare barn finds. It's not active in vintage racing and hasn't been on the track since 1979. It should be pretty interesting to have a look at it. The car is in Reston, Virginia, and our field trip begins as we head down the 2-lane and turn onto I-370. We join up with I-270 and head south toward Washington, D.C. At the split north of town, we bear to the right toward Virginia. Soon we're crossing the Potomac River on the Cabin John Bridge on the Washington Beltway. We leave the Beltway on the Reston Toll Road. A couple more turns and we're there. The car looks interesting. It's complete and seems to be reasonably straight. With the cockpit surround off, we look at the chassis. The car comes with a couple of sets of aluminum wheels. We can use the aluminum wheels on a Titan Mk9 we're currently restoring back at the shop. A big plus. Up front, the chassis looks straight, and the dashboard and green leather steering wheel are all original. and we decide on the spot that we want the car. Outside are the rest of the body parts with a red toolbox full of goodies. The car logbook has 2 photos of the car when it was last raised. We make an offer on the car and head for home. As we cross the Cabin John Bridge, we hope we'll be returning soon to pick up the Mk6. As we get near the shop, our thoughts return to finishing up the assembly of the suspension of the Titan Mk9, and we get right back to it. We're back in the shop now, and it's time to continue work on our Titan Mk9 Formula Ford. We're going to assemble the rear suspension of the car next. We made an offer on that Titan Mk6 out in Reston. You can never have too many Titans. We already have a Mk6 and we have this Mk9, but it'd sure be nice to have another Mk6. Our offer wasn't accepted by the seller, but that doesn't mean we didn't get the car. We just have to wait a few days and see if anybody else makes a higher offer. If we do end up with that Titan Mk6, we'll go through it in one of the future episodes of Vintage Garage so you can get a look at it up close. Right now, let's move on and start assembling the rear suspension of the Titan Mk9. This is one of the uprights. This is the top link for the rear suspension. This is one of the pieces we nickel plated in a previous episode of Vintage Garage. And we have all the suspension links and other things here in this tray. And we're going to put those on the rear of the car. So let's get started. Just as we did on the front of the car, we use a tap to clean the threads on all the legs where a rod end will be installed. This is the right rear lower wishbone. A single 1/2-inch rod end holds this wishbone to the car. We like using plastic mustard bottles for oil cans. They don't scratch the part and they don't spill if they tip over. We use our aligning punch to give us better leverage when installing the rod end. The wishbone is installed on the chassis with a single 1/2-inch bolt. We install a nylon-filled lock nut on the back and then tighten it with the butterfly wrench. As with all the other parts, we check the assembly for any binding or looseness. We cleaned the threads and installed rod ends in both ends of the lower trailing link. We install a special washer on the mounting bolt that protects the joint from separation in the event of bearing failure. We put a lock nut on the bolt and tighten it with the butterfly wrench. And then check the part for freedom of motion. We assemble the rear damper assembly exactly as we did the front. We screw down the spring pad, install a spring and then the keeper, and screw up the spring pad until the spring is just barely compressed. For neatness, we turn the slot and the spring keeper downward and then put the damper assembly on the car with a temporary bolt. We then install a 7/16 inch rod end at the lower rear corner of the rear upright. At the top of the upright, we install two small triangular-shaped plates that we nickel-plated. Each plate has 3 holes in it. The center hole takes a plain 3/8 bolt to hold the parts together. The outer hole takes the special clevis rod for the upper trailing link. The inner hole takes a long bolt with special washers for the top link. We also plated this spacer which goes into the inner hole. We tighten the nuts on all 3 parts, and in effect they become part of the rear upright. We finally install a damper assembly, bolting one end to the lower wishbone and the other end to the chassis. The rod end at the lower rear of the upright slips into a hole in the lower wishbone. We hold the upright and put a nut on the rod end to hold the upright in place. We install a long bolt through the top link and fasten one end to the chassis. We then loosen and remove the top bolt on the upright and pass it through the other end of the top link and then back through the triangular plates and spacer. We connect the lower trailing link to the special clevis bolt at the lower front of the upright and then install the upper trailing link. We install the lock nuts and tighten them all with the butterfly wrench. We repeat all the steps for the left rear corner of the car. We use a lining punch to hold the clevis rod from turning while we tighten it up. We finished the assembly of the right rear corner of the car, and we've now completed the car to the rolling chassis stage. If we put the tires and wheels on it, it would roll and it would steer, and we could push it around the shop. The next time we work on the car, we'll be installing the brake master cylinders and pedals and generally getting the brakes working. After that, we'll have to build a motor for the car and put the motor and gearbox in the car. Then we have a lot of body work to do on the car to finish it up. That's it for this week at Vintage Garage. We made great progress on the Titan Mk9 Formula Ford, and the car will go quickly together from here on out. We look forward to driving it next season. Next week we have another full show. We're going to drive Route 66 from Chicago to Los Angeles. We're on our way to El Mirage, the dry lake just east of Los Angeles, where the Southern California Timing Association is holding their championships for land speed record cars. These are the same cars that run at the Bonneville Salt Flats every summer, and it should be a lot of fun. On the way to El Mirage, we'll follow the trail of historic Route 66 through Illinois, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and into California. We'll see some memorable sights along the way, including some great towns and big scenery. So until next week, thanks for coming. Glad you were here. Keep the shiny side up. We'll see you next week. If you'd like more information about any of the projects we've worked on today, please visit our website at www.vintagegarage.com. There's a link to our email address on the website. Please email us. We'd like to hear from you. Till next time, keep the shiny side up. Thanks for coming. See you next week.